Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be invited. I've followed the work of Health AI Partnership. I've collaborated with Mark and a few others from the group. So it's a real pleasure to be here this morning, or afternoon, I guess, for you guys. Um, so my name is Melissa. I've been AI director at SickKids Hospital before coming to Adelaide, Australia, where I'm AI director at the Women's and Children's Hospital Network. And so we've been navigating this issue of how do you test AI tools locally? How do you make sure they're going to show proof of value? How do you make sure they're going to benefit patients? And this project really emerged out of seeing the gap both ethically and empirically. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the Ghana lands, always was and always will be Ghana land. And I would like to thank particularly my colleagues in the Aboriginal Health and Wellbeing Unit at the hospital who have navigated these challenges with me. So I'll talk today about why silent trials and some of the motivation around that, and then introduce Project Canary and talk to you a bit about our scoping review results. And then I'll spend a bit of time kind of talking about what comes next and what we're seeing as gaps. So one thing that I want to stress is that there's still this residual uncertainty, and particularly with each new iteration of models, new sets of methodologies, and new approaches to using AI. It's this uncertainty issue that we continue to navigate. Uncertainty with respect to, financial benefit, patient benefit, clinical use uncertainty. And so while we know that AI tools can help us to use all of these things, there's really this gap of how do you get it to actually do that in the right way? We know that there are still widespread model failures in translation to the bedside, sometimes limited internal generalizability as well as transferability between sites, differences in local suitability if something works in one setting and you want to try it in another. And because of that, we don't always know what are the conditions that set up benefit to patients in the healthcare system. Even well-validated models sometimes aren't translated into practice with the critical information that clinicians need to actually use them appropriately and ethically. And there's this great paper from Deb Raji and colleagues, it's 2022, but it's still relevant today, where they analyzed 282 cases of AI implementation and developed this taxonomy of different types of failures, ranging from how the task itself was constructed or its problem formulation, to engineering failures and how things were actually designed and put together, to post-deployment failures, including human factors issues, and communication failures, resulting in a lack of trust. And one of the things that I've found challenging as an ethicist is that when I look at many of our ethics guidelines that are coming from high-level sources, they sort of skip this issue of functionality. They sort of skip this issue of does it actually work first? And instead, we go to things like, is it ethical AI or is it value aligned or trustworthy or human centered? And so for me, the ethics of translation really starts with making sure how do we know that this is actually going to have a good effect and how we set up those conditions. This probably won't be a surprise to many of the folks in the audience. Duke University was one of the very few to actually publish a negative result on finding label leakage during a silent trial. And because of discovering that early, they did not have to end up in a situation where there was, a waste of resources, potentially negative impacts to patients, loss of trust with clinicians. By choosing to not translate the model immediately and doing this silent trial, they were able to get that information. By contrast, most people will be familiar with the sepsis detection algorithm, which was implemented and had highly variable performance across different settings. And a silent trial could have assisted people with figuring out, whether this was going to work in their setting or not. There is the ongoing class action lawsuit against United Health. This was an interesting one for me because before there was even a lawsuit, doctors were coming up to me at conferences and telling me about this algorithm that their hospital was using for discharge prediction. They were saying it's really, really wrong a lot. And I'm having to send home patients that I really don't think are ready to go home. What are the ethics of that? And so this has resulted in a lot of harm to people and a lot of mistrust. And of course, there was the MIT report showing 95% of generative AI pilots are failing. And that's not because the technology isn't working as it should. It's doing what it was supposed to do. But how we, as human beings, as organizations, how we controlled and set up the conditions for translation has really lacked precision in order to support people using these tools effectively. And recently, Anna Goldenberg and Jenna Waynes put this piece in Nature Medicine asking, is AI actually improving healthcare? And they note that there's a lot of translation that's happening, but right now, we're still missing this piece of evaluation that's focused on clinical impact. Very often we'll see, reports of the AUC. Sometimes we might see, true positives, false positives, but we're still really lacking this information on clinical impact. And so we're missing a critical piece of what makes AI translation ethical. Most folks will know that technical performance in silico is not sufficient to support a belief that a model will actually work in a clinical environment. And to be really clear, when I say will work, I mean that if the intent is to use the model to improve some outcome, and it's not doing that, or we're not measuring the conditions for doing that, then we don't actually know if it works. A good technical performance, therefore, just doesn't help us navigate some of this residual uncertainty around questions about AI integration. Now, historically, randomized controlled trials have kind of sat at the top of the evidentiary food chain because they do provide the most reliable information about whether a specific intervention directly produces benefit under a set of described conditions. No doubt this is valuable for most types of interventions, but should we be doing this every single time? It would be quite an ask for most healthcare organizations to actually do that. And in many cases, actually doing an RCT would violate certain ethical conditions. And so when we do an RCT, really actually hinges on this issue of what's called clinical equipoise. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So equipoise historically related to this state of genuine uncertainty about the merits of a given intervention relative to the current standard. Now, originally, philosophers were talking about a specific clinician who was caring for a patient, had a duty of care to that patient. A new drug may come along and they may face a dilemma. Do I offer this patient standard of care that, we know it might not be perfect, but we have good evidence behind it, whereas this new thing, we don't have evidence, and that's why we're doing research. And they had to navigate that uncertainty of whether or not they recommended to their patient to actually try a clinical trial. Now, Friedman advanced this idea that it's not really about the individual clinician because we can have different subjective beliefs and values and morals, but it's about the state of uncertainty. So within a medical community, if a good proportion of experts in the medical community are believing that there is good potential for this new intervention to be better, then we have said that ethically it is okay to offer enrollment in a clinical trial for our patients, even when a standard exists. Now, research ethics committees typically apply this concept of equipoise to determine whether or not an RCT should proceed or not. And Alex John London has advanced this idea of an integrated approach to equipoise, where he has said that, look, RCTs aren't always the best paradigm. What we should be doing is doing them when they provide socially valuable information and when the welfare of participants is safeguarded. So not necessarily doing things just because they provide the best evidence, but when they're going to provide the right evidence at the right time. A couple of things that equipoise is not that I tend to hear from clinicians a little bit is sometimes people will think it is an individual's own uncertainty about the merits of a new intervention. Other times people think it's 50-50, or other times they'll say it's a gut instinct. And it's actually a practical test that is applied. So what Alex London says is that we need to be using this paradigm to generate socially valuable information while ensuring the welfare of participants. And he notes that there should be a special concern for basic interests. So people generally, in the case of facing two options like this, a person should decide whether or not they accept the risks of advancing that knowledge. And he says that we should have no unnecessary risks, so only doing what is required to generate the desired information. So, for example, we don't want to run a trial of a new AI tool for too long. At the point when we've collected information to show that that may be superior, we need to pivot as soon as possible. Given, proper statistical tests, we need to pivot that into practice. And so when we look at equipoise as a practical test, we ask, would a reasonable proportion of experts find this intervention to have merit? And if you have too many people saying, yes, this is definitively superior, then you don't have the right conditions to do a clinical trial. And so, what I've been thinking about a lot is how does a silent trial actually help us get the evidence to inform equipoise? So, if we're running a silent trial and seeing actually this AI tool is performing really, really well, we're all pretty confident that that if we use this prediction at this time, this is going to be better. Then we do pivot directly into integration. If we still have uncertainty, so if we're still saying, okay, it could work, but we don't actually know the effect of using this information at this time, could we end up, over prescribing or over testing, and is that worse than what we're doing now? Then we might have the conditions for a clinical trial. Now, thinking about this issue of no unnecessary risk, I think this is where we could really do a lot more work in refining how we do clinical studies, both, randomized control trials and observational or pre-post. So typically, clinical trials with AI involve a change to the delivery of care. It might be the timing of how people are treated. It might be, a new pathway, or it might be a change to the quality and character of that care. And that's where that uncertainty sits. And so, what we do to reduce risks are thinking about how do we mitigate issues of automation bias. So, when clinicians over rely on AI or under rely as well. And many people will also be familiar with some of the studies that have come out showing that sometimes when you give clinicians an explanation for a given prediction, that actually worsens the possibility that they're going to act on an incorrect AI prediction. And so we don't actually have a lot of evidence that explainability itself helps us make better decisions. There's also the risk of unwanted deviations in clinical practice and racial or gender discriminations, which again, I think many people will be familiar with at this point. So the idea that sometimes when we're actually personalizing, we can over tailor and start relying on factors that are not actually clinically relevant. There's also the risk of additional burdens in terms of the time required, cognitive load, or training on a new technology, which lead to research waste. And clinicians are busy. They don't tend to like when we're introducing something that's really new, and they've got to put a lot of effort into figuring this out. And there's also risk that implementation goes awry in unexpected ways. So sometimes we have, totally new behavior that starts to emerge, particularly with some of the generative or agentic tools that we're seeing. When we're thinking about socially valuable information, what that actually means is whether or not initiating a clinical trial would provide socially valuable information, such as if there are people who are still uncertain, would this actually shift their opinion? You can think about things like vaccine trials as a good example, where we start from a place where we don't know if this is going to reduce disease, reduce mortality, reduce burden. And so there might be a lot of people who believe in vaccines a priori, but really we need that evidence to help shift that uncertainty to show something is beneficial. Now, one of the things about AI is that we see that elements of workflow integration, human-computer interaction, and fairness and bias can all independently affect whether or not a tool produces a net benefit, and this is beyond the accuracy alone. So when we're thinking about putting together the conditions that we need to make sure that we're accounting for all these different ways that the benefit of a given AI tool might be influenced. We're increasingly seeing concern about implementation waste and backtracking. It's actually one of the interesting things that I sometimes do is look through Reddit threads of clinicians talking about AI and seeing how many people are commenting on, particular tools that are, alerting in really strange situations or that are really bothersome or that everyone ignores. There's some that I know people kind of drag off the screen. And so if you look at the numbers, it looks like we've implemented, but is it actually benefiting people? We don't necessarily know. So technical information doesn't give us the information for equipoise, but initiating a clinical trial is not always the right decision. So what evidence should we be relying on? Again, I'm going to say that the silent evaluation phase is really important to helping us make these kinds of decisions. As an example, we completed actually a 3-month silent trial of iScribe, which is a Australian developed AI scribe device. We ran it for 3 months in the child development unit in silent mode. So we did consent patients to enrollment in the study. And what we did was we had it ambient listening during their encounter. We had the clinicians generate a draft note and send that to the research team, and then they completed their documentation as usual. We did this for a couple reasons. One is that we genuinely did not know, these are all based off of, mainly American foundation models. And so we didn't know whether that was going to work well in the Australian context. We also didn't know how a tool was going to work in the context of the child development unit, where we have a child, typically a child who's being assessed for autism or other sorts of neurodevelopmental challenges. We have multiple speakers, we have translators present. So these are not the conditions that most scribes have been tested in. And really, we wanted to make a decision about proof of value. We would be purchasing a scribe, which are pretty expensive. We wanted to make sure it's going to be the right decision. What we ended up seeing is during that silent trial, we saw that this did really well. My colleagues in Aboriginal Health, who were co-investigators on this project, were looking for bias. They found it to be quite acceptable in terms of how it described Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander consumers. And so we found that, it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to run a randomized clinical trial at this point. And so we proceed direct to integration through an observational trial where we're still collecting information about use. And so that's actually underway in our initiating in our university or in our institution this month. Now, when we run that trial, obviously, part of the monitoring for us also involves some form of clinical research. And so we're measuring the impact of using that tool with respect to things like note quality, person-centeredness, cultural safety for Aboriginal consumers. We're also looking at the effects on clinician well-being and consumer perspectives of that experience. And my colleague, Dr. Tiernan Cross, is doing an environmental impact assessment and essentially looking at setting up a dashboard for Witchin that would allow us to track how much energy we're using in using the scribe. That allows us to make certain kinds of decisions like, are our templates not optimal? Are clinicians needing to query the model too many times? Do we need to refine them to minimize model queries? And generally just starting to measure these things because it's something we know is important and a lot of people are talking about it. We haven't really been sure how to do it. And so this is our initial attempt to see what that looks like at Witchin. So Project Canary was really developed to try to build normative guidance for how institutions should conduct different types of silent evaluations. We've completed our scoping review in the first phase of our Delphi study. We're now moving into more targeted and specific in-depth discussions around particular areas that we still need a bit more conversation in building out content. And what we'll be doing is building a consensus-based toolkit in order to help other institutions run these silent trials. I think one of the things that we have a shared value with respect to Health AI Partnership is that we believe that any institution that wants to use AI should be equipped with the skills and knowledge to actually test whether it's going to work for them well and how to monitor that. And knowing that different health institutions have different levels of support for running those kinds of things, this is something that we think that we can help with. So, as I've said, silent evaluations serve two critical goals for ethical AI translation. The first is to make sure a model is going to work in your setting, and the second is that ethically establishing the right evidence foundation to inform decisions about prospective evaluation and use. Um, Folks who may not be familiar, just to be really explicit about it, a silent trial really looks like this, where you have care as usual from the patient. There's no change to the care that patients receive. But in the background, under a silent evaluation, you're receiving a copy of that clinical information that's essentially set to a test environment, to a research team, to an AI team. And they record the information throughout the patient journey. And the idea here is to run the model, to run a prediction at the desired time that you want to integrate that model into the workflow. Um, you want to get a copy, essentially, you want to record the prediction that was made at that time, and then look at the outcome. And that allows you to hypothesize if the clinician had that information at this time, potentially what kind of decisions could have been made for this patient and what would the impact potentially be. This fits in well to the overall ecosystem of how we test other interventions within medicine. So drugs, for example, you've got your preclinical phase, same with surgical innovation. And so Tripod AI and Stardy AI have looked at this phase, but in a technical sense. So one of the things that we've looked at Project Canary is that, we definitely want to do this. We want the technical aspects, but we also want to think about this phase more broadly, in a sense that we are helping institutions get set up for effective and ethical AI translation, which includes some of these areas around human factors, around governance, around policies. And we find that this is really what clinicians are actually looking for. Obviously, they don't care about the AUC most of the time. What they really want to know is what are the things that I need to know about how this model works so that I can integrate it into my care practice. And we found this through a qualitative study that we did with clinicians across pediatric and adult hospitals, where we went through an in-depth interview, presenting them with, an AI prediction from a tool that had been well validated, no concerns about functionality. But what we were looking at is how do you use this to make good decisions about your patient? And so we found that, of course, they want to know things about the machine learning model, just some basic facts, but they wanted to know more than what we usually present to them in things like the model facts label. So they also wanted to see how does this model work within this context. Many clinicians would talk about, we get weird numbers on our screen all the time. You can have patients, babies having aberrant heart rhythms that look really scary, except actually the patient's diaper is being changed. So they want to know, is the model actually integrating artifacts like that into its prediction, or are those part of it? They also wanted to know what's the model's knowledge. So does it actually have the right information? So they flagged that sometimes if one of your data sources is really unreliable, it's not going to help the model actually work effectively. And ultimately, they wanted to draw from their medical knowledge base, knowing the patient and that family as an individual, as a unit, knowing what's going on the unit that day, and all of those things get integrated into how they make decisions. One of the things that they flagged is that, for example, if you've got a patient where the decision is to extubate the patient for that day, even if you've got a model with strong confidence that this is going to go well, but the risk for that particular patient, if it doesn't, are so high, you want to do the extubation at a time when you've got the ear, nose, and throat team around to intervene. And so that might mean that you can have the best prediction in the world, but if it's at 10 o'clock at night, you wouldn't necessarily follow that prediction at that time. So there's a lot of things that go into this, and that's what we're trying to do with the setup to the silent trial is get that information that we can give to them so that they're prepared to integrate this in an effective way. So as a start, my I have to update this actually. Lana received her PhD approval last week. So she's now Dr. Lana Takamirov. She did probably one of the most challenging scoping reviews that I've ever had to do in my life because this is a very new area. But we looked at 6 years of original research published in English across three databases. And we looked at studies that were looking at this general idea of a silent phase evaluation. So they didn't always call it that, but it was a situation where they were getting some data in a live or near live format to assess the potential translatability of a model. We developed a data extraction form from a CANAIRI steering group, which represented people from multiple different domains, all the way from health law and policy and regulation to, data science and human factors and HCI. And we carried this assumption that if the silent phase is fundamental to enable clinical translation, what are all the things that we might want to know about? What practices are ultimately valuable toward that goal? Each paper was triple reviewed by team members. Sometimes we had a couple people checking again for inter-rater reliability because we wanted to be really sure of the ones that we used. And we ended up extracting 75 studies over this time. Now, one of the first things that we found was that there was really confusing terminology used. We would see titles that were like a retrospective, prospective, near live, non-silent validation, and you would be in a situation sometimes where you were reading through, it would say it was a silent study, and then all of a sudden it would say, X% of clinicians changed their decision because of the model, and we were thinking, well, I thought it was silent. So we tried to put together a bit of a taxonomy here, looking at different ways that people might approach this phase. One was temporal validation or external validation, where we're testing another set of data potentially over time, but not necessarily aligned to the clinical workflow. We saw prospective or internal validation studies where it was more of a cross-sectional reassessment of a model's performance in a new test set. Prospective algorithmic validation or a traditional silent trial where we saw a live or near live model validation with the separation of that evaluation from clinical care, no modifications to workflow or care delivery. And then we also saw prospective clinical validation. So that was where we had a traditional silent trial plus the verification of model outputs against some ground truth. And then we were looking particularly for this idea of translational trials, which we've focused on, where we're looking at prospective clinical validation plus potentially some human factors, looking at the integrity of the data and model pipeline, legal and professional considerations, and economic assessments. So predominantly, we saw people were looking at AUC, less often true positive, true negatives, false positive, false negatives. Some conducted clinical verification. So this might have been against labels annotated within the health record. That was the most common. I think that methodology is about as reliable as how trustworthy we think that our EMR labels are. Another way of doing it was human verification of model outputs. So you would have a situation where the AI would run a prediction. You'd have a doctor or a couple of doctors looking at that model prediction and saying, yes, that's correct, or no, it's not correct. Or we'd have a situation of independent comparison of AI performance to the clinical standard. One of the examples of this is reader studies in radiology. So this was quite common in radiology. There are very limited details on the evaluators for numbers 2 and 3, how they were recruited or their experience. We know anecdotally that in a lot of cases, people are using medical students or medical registrars because they're available and they're typically keen to participate in research. But that then introduces the question of if we're validating models off of relatively lesser experienced clinicians, how does that affect the reliability? There are very few failure mode evaluations, so very few people took the step to say when the model fails, who's it failing for and under what conditions? Why is it failing for these kinds of patients? And there were even fewer fairness evaluations. Among the very, very few who articulated anything about fairness, very often it was taken care of in the model building step, and yet among the studies where they did a fairness evaluation, we found major gaps in the performance of the model from the retrospective to the silent phase. We also looked at the ones that were software as medical device. And so there were 8 studies that were evaluating a commercially available AI device. Only half of those actually reported the approval regime. So whether they were CE marked, cleared, or approved devices with their class rating. And there was a huge range from major to minor performance discrepancies compared with the work that underpinned the approval of that model. So, in 3 of these studies, they found humans outperform the AI system in terms of their accuracy. And then in a couple of others, they found that AI did worse for certain kinds of conditions or for certain kinds of users. And so this really raises the question of when we provide regulatory approval to a medical device, what does that actually mean? And if we are looking, let's say, at women's and kids, if we're looking at models that are available commercially, how do we make sure that they're going to work for us before we make the decision to actually procure that model? When we looked at socio-technical considerations, and this is really my postdoc's area of work, she's in human factors and cognitive science. There wasn't a lot. Sometimes people produced like companion papers where they evaluated these, and there were some really interesting ways that people went about that. When they were done, though, they mostly consisted of what Hugh Harvey has called vanity metrics. So it's sort of that survey at the end. How much do you like my model? Is it your favorite model ever? Is it so, so good? And they're often at the end and sometimes not reported. So you'd see a line where they'd say, 93% of clinicians loved our model or something like that. Very few actually described user engagement prior to or during the silent trial. And this is really interesting because if you look at the good machine learning practice or the good machine learning principles that have been around for nearly a decade now, this is like one of the number one things that you should involve clinicians when you're designing a model. And very, very few actually did that. There were a few that considered calibration or thresholding to mitigate alert fatigue. So during the silent trial, they were looking at, okay, if we set it to this sensitivity, this is how many alerts it's going to fire in a given day. This is what the false positive ratio is going to be. Some of them looked at workflow integration. So, if we alert 24 hours out versus 48 hours out, and did some evaluations around the data flow in the pipeline. So the stability of the model, was there model downtime? Were there internet outages? I can tell you in Australia, the internet outages thing is a real issue, as well as for many other folks who aren't in a major urban academic center. Some described attempts to address automation bias and tested interface design or about how to present the prediction to end users. So some talked about being aware of this problem with explainability that can nudge people in the wrong direction. And so they actually tested different ways of providing a presentation of how the model's predictions were outputted to clinicians and seeing what effect that actually had on them. And yes, that is in a sense not silent, but the key to how they were doing this was that they weren't doing it for the patients in real time. So they would maybe have a focus group or bring a bunch of clinicians together, show them different visualizations and assess the effect. Or they would test different methods during a silent trial. So they might have 2 different methods of visualization for clinicians to do the human annotation component. Very few engaged consumers at any point. Sometimes this is more relevant, sometimes this is less relevant. In Australia, we have a really, really strong mandate to include consumers as much as possible. And so we can think of that all the way from the inform model, where we are just telling consumers what we're doing, all the way to the partnership model, where they're part of the research team. So CANAIRI advocates for an expanded view on silent trials, and this is where this concept of translational trial comes in, and with this idea of looking at the whole package. That doesn't necessarily mean in every paper you're going to report on all of this stuff because we know that that's really big. But with the translational trial, the relevancy of that framing is for people like me who are in charge of making decisions about, are we going to integrate this model, yes or no? Are we going to procure this model, yes or no? What's the full set of things that we need to know about in order to make a good decision on that account? And so we think it encompasses all of these aspects here. So for our toolkit, the way that we've mapped it out through the Delphi process and through our surveys is really looking at this pre-trial planning aspect. And this was something that really came out during the interviews where people were talking about, you know what, like sometimes we're getting down the line and we're realizing we didn't actually kind of do some of these things at the beginning that we should have done. And so this pre-trial planning aspect actually is really, really important, particularly if you're not talking about an internally developed model. We need that technical or algorithmic validation, the traditional silent trial, that's step number one, because we want to make sure that a model just works technically before we start, with something like 3 or 4, where we're asking for clinical verification of model outputs and human factors evaluation, which we can still do in silent mode, in an offline fashion. One of the areas where people felt a lot more need for support is around ethics, legal, regulatory, and professional considerations. So there were a couple of situations where, people would talk about, we have this model that we know is technically a medical device, but it's not regulated, and we don't really know what to do about that. There were other situations where people had developed a model that was intended to be used by nurses, except that they had never considered whether nurses were actually licensed to act on that output. And so making sure those kinds of things are considered at the beginning in that pretrial planning phase is really important. And then ultimately, people wanted a little bit of support around, at the end of the day, we've run this silent trial. Is it a go or no go? And how do we make those decisions? And this can be relevant for a number of different groups. This can be for the AI teams who might be providing the recommendation to senior leadership. For decision makers, the people who actually have to, press go or not go. And for HREX or institutional ethics committees or AI committees where it might be a collaborative decision where they're deciding whether or not a model is going to go live. So some of the implications that we found here is that we really need transparency and consolidation of reporting, not necessarily thinking about, doing another reporting guideline, because I think there's many different ways to do a silent trial, but just in terms of consistency of the terminology. When we say something is run silently, what does that actually mean? And making sure that we're consistently reporting on those things in the literature. Like I said, there was a major gap around the things that were most clinically important for clinicians. So looking at that kind of rainbow chart, the specific kinds of things that a clinician really wanted to know, which patients is it going to fail for? Is this going to be fair? If someone asks me, has it been tested on patients like me? I want to know what the answer is to that. If we close this gap, we think that this can be a really useful tool for health institutions to use that guidance to share accountability of AI use. So making decisions collaboratively rather than based on, a technical performance. And we find that this is relevant even for regulatory approved medical devices to optimize local use, to choose the right products to integrate. And so, CANAIRI's key priorities include practical advice for those institutions of varying digital maturity. I can tell you at Women's and Children's, like we're a pretty small health network, relatively speaking. And so the team that actually ran the silent trial in the CDU, none of them are researchers. This was their first research project. And how they actually went about doing that and doing the work that ultimately helped us make the decision to integrate that AI scribe really gave us a lot of lessons in terms of feasibility and what can we ask of other people to do. Some of our next steps are we want to do some more selective engagement around silent trial methods for large language models. Um, Ours was at the time that we initially submitted the manuscript, it was the first, but I've actually seen some other silent trials for generative AI tools that have been coming out. And really curious to see what this methodology might look like for an agentic AI system. And I think we draw particularly from software engineering's practices around things like beta testing and red teaming and integrating that into our guidance. From a regulatory side of things, so Health Canada and IMDRF are considering the weight of silent trial results as part of the clinical evidence submissions. Many of us will be familiar with some of the work that has come out showing that many of the FDA approvals and approvals around the world, or clearances, sorry, have used only the in silico study to actually make that decision. So at Women's and Children's Health Network, we are using silent trials to actually demonstrate our compliance with the National Safety and Health Quality Service Standards under Standard 1, which is clinical governance. And for research ethics, institutional committees, and AI committees, again, there's a lot of opportunity to use this to inform equipoise as a practical test to make decisions about our implementation strategy. So next steps, we're preparing this work with Standards Australia on AI readiness standards in Australia using the ISO 42001 standard around artificial intelligence. Really, this is focused around products that are not being regulated by the TGA, so they might be, outside of regulation or they might be cleared. And looking at how the silent trial really helps us do good AI governance. And with that, I will say thank you very much for listening. I really want to thank my colleagues within the CANAIRI Health Network. Thank you to our youth partners. And you can check out our website online, which is going to be updated very soon, actually. And if you're interested in running silent trials, I would love to hear from you. Please do reach out. And happy to take questions.
Okay. Feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand and unmute. I'm going to start with the one from Marie that she put in the chat. And she asked, can you describe more about how you assess for bias or hallucinations? And what did you need for those activities, such as to retain the transcript, recording for Q&A, etc.?
Yes, so we actually developed our own kind of quality coding framework. This was based on the medical algorithmic audit work in the Lancet Digital Health, which I was part of a team that ran this initially a few years back. So what we did was we started with this is through the FMEA failure modes and effects analysis framework, which starts with mapping what are we accountable for, what does good documentation look like, looking at our accountabilities under the standards, and particularly cultural safety for my colleagues in Aboriginal health. And we built this framework where we first assessed, are any of these risks present, yes or no, which included inserted information about medical facts, inserted information about family history, inserted information that was not clinically relevant, and we assessed a number of different other parameters as well. Then we use that complemented by the bias taxonomy that Stephen Foll and colleagues published in Nature Medicine a few years ago. And so for the main quality framework, what we did was the patient would come in, we'd get the full transcript of the visit, and then we get the AI generated draft, and then we get the final clinical document. We had two independent evaluators. One was a physician, the other one was a allied health practitioner. And so they completed that rating. So they said, how many times are these risks coming up? And then what is the nature of them? So doing a bit of qualitative work as well. What we found, this particular model had fewer hallucinations than others, but where it was most likely to get things wrong was in the particular family dynamics. So it didn't do great with things like, if you're in a visit and you've got three people talking, who said what in relation to what? So sometimes the mother might report something and it was attributed to the child or vice versa. So that actually really helped us provide good guidance to clinicians for the integration phase where we could say, look, this is where the highest rates of errors are. So maybe, if you've got five people talking, maybe you're rephrasing and clarifying. So, mom, you're telling me that you had trouble sleeping because the patient was up with these kinds of symptoms. And that helped the AI tool to actually get it right. What my colleagues did is use a methodology, a cultural methodology called yarning. There's different yarning circles and ways of approaching yarning where they would look at the outputs of these models, they would look at the comparison and they would reflect and discuss on the different aspects that relate to cultural safety for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And so they would look at, is this describing us in a strengths-based way? Are there, objectionable content in there? And so they were able to complete a bias assessment of that model and give me a recommendation as to whether they felt that this was going to be a safe product and how we actually support clinicians for working with it in a culturally safe way.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. The other question that I'm seeing in the chat is from Yasser. And Yasser, feel free to unmute and elaborate on this if you're able. But you asked, are any clinical LLM safety work in this direction?
Yep. So I think so. The AI Scribe one is definitely, it's an LLM based product. A couple of the other ones that I've seen as well have been like silent trial evaluation of LLMs. They seem to involve a similar methodology where we're testing this in sort of an offline way. We're not actually using the outputs to make a decision at that point. And I've seen a lot more work where people are looking at what are the right metrics for our use case. Because I think if you look at the LLM literature, a lot of it has been on, passing these benchmarks, which we know don't necessarily translate well to actual clinical practice. We've seen other things where it might be actually judgments about whether or not something sounds good, whether it sounds empathic or whether it sounds, nice. And so people are actually starting to say, okay, what is the content of the language that actually matters for us? So in some cases, like with the scribe study, for example, we have different kinds of notes. So there's some where you want to judge them based on their medical completeness. You don't want them to be very long, so you want to make sure they're efficient in facilitating timely communication. Whereas there are others where we want to evaluate based on, things like warmth. Are they strengths forward? Are they, supportive of the consumer? So I've seen a lot more work where people are starting to look at like what's the actual specific kind of language that we want to see? How often is that coming out? And how does that relate to our particular clinical needs? And I think, oh, sorry, yeah, I was already jumping to the next question.
That sounds great. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the role of silent trials, how they're conducted and evolve as agentic or even autonomous AI tools are adopted. It's really interesting because I think we're actually seeing a little bit more of again that notion of beta testing when it comes to agentic AI. So for that, I've helped a couple of teams work on some protocols around what would a silent trial look like for an agentic tool, where you might be preventing the ultimate output from being actioned, but you would see at each step of the workflow or the agent's pathway, you're collecting information about what's actually happening, what is it accessing, how is it proceeding to the next step, and checking what that means across those stages. There have been some really interesting studies. So one of them was the Agents of Chaos paper that came out pretty recently, where they were showing actually it doesn't always do what it says it's doing. And so there's, a lot of other things going on in the background, and a silent trial is a method where you can kind of see, okay, what are we expecting to happen and what is actually happening at each step? How often is that happening and is that a problem? And the autonomous AI tools too. So I'm thinking about some of the situations where you might automate a portion of, the readings, for example, with radiology reports, or automating maybe, normal scans or results. You can use a silent trial to essentially assess how many of those would be immediately you immediately act on that in an autonomous fashion, and compare that to what would happen if it was human review. And you'd want to be able to also see, if we are, let's say we're automating results, returning results for normal scans. How often is that actually correct? And, maybe if it's 100%, then great, we can use that autonomous system. If it's closer to 50% or if it's lower, then maybe that tells you that that's a situation where it shouldn't be fully autonomous. So it can also help make decisions around, how much autonomy do we actually give this AI tool?
Very insightful. I feel like we're having a lot of conversations as a community about what agentic AI is going to look like and how it's going to be deployed. So thank you for that. I'm looking at Sam's question in the chat, and I think you touched on this a little bit. But she said earlier you mentioned the article is actually improving healthcare. Have you considered what to measure in order to determine that? So, for example, how can you measure if an AI scribe is improving patient care? And I will actually just add on to that a little bit and say, when you're looking at these tools from different stakeholder perspectives who have different measures of success, how do you kind of make that decision around whether or not something is successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think success looks different to different people. Um, I think, similarly to North America, there's a lot of conversation around productivity in Australia. And I think we're seeing from the evidence in the literature that AI scribes might not be helping that a huge amount, at least not if you're checking them appropriately. I think there was that recent, study that showed, it's like 42 seconds a week or something like that, or a note. And so one of the ways of defining that might be improved patient throughput, rather than necessarily time savings. In the context of the child development unit where we did the initial trial, one of the things that people talked about is, yes, we do actually want to see more patients. We don't necessarily want to use spare time to go on an extra coffee break, or there are some cases where people, want to make sure they're going home early because they're already overworked. In the context of the CDU, they said, you know what, we would really like to, if we have 3 hours of documentation time a week that we're using, if we could even reduce that by half, that's one more patient that we could see a week. We have a long wait list of patients who are waiting to see us. So one of the ways to measure that is through, are we reducing wait lists? However, that also puts pressure on people around this kind of speed component, which is where I think we see a lot of problems with respect to how effectively people are reviewing AI generated draft notes. So one of the other things that we're doing is these qualitative interviews with clinicians to see, what actually is the effect. And I think what I expect is that we're going to see a lot more nuance come out. We're already hearing from people where they're saying, I could see actually this would be really helpful for these really long consults that we have. Maybe not that helpful for some of the shorter consults, and people might not use them. Another way of measuring improvement to patient care is the quality and character of the care. And here's where I think there's a little bit of a mix. So, most of our consumers have said, I really like my doctor being able to look at me while we're talking. Doctors have said, I like the fact that I'm not having to focus on typing and what the patient is saying, and that I can just talk to them. So that's potentially a quality of care aspect. However, other people have said, you know what, that microphone sitting there is just really creepy. And it is creeping me out that there's this like transcript of what I'm saying. And I know you guys aren't keeping it, but it still weirds me out and it changes the character of the care. So there might be different opinions on that. I think as well, this issue of healthcare sustainability is a big topic, particularly out of places like the NHS where they had this kind of net zero idea. They were trying to go to lower environmental impact. And so that's another way that we can measure whether or not it's improving patient care, indirectly, because a lot of our youth have said this is actually the most important thing to them. They're like, I know you can use a lot of these things to help, but honestly, this is what I'm most worried about. And so if we're not addressing that, we're potentially missing something that they care about quite deeply. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can measure it. And we have consumer investigators as part of our project team. And so they have set up, what they think are the things that we should measure in order to actually measure impact to patient care.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much again, Melissa, for joining us. We really appreciate you making the time. We know with the time difference, it's quite early for you. So we appreciate you coming in, sharing these results with us, and taking the time to answer the questions from our audience as well.